again, Kaya, and welcome to the Australians Teach English podcast, the podcast by language learners, with language learners, for language learners. My name is Glenn, and I'm the host of the Australians Teach English podcast. And if you would like to contribute to this podcast and have a say on creative content, then you can join our Patreon. And in today's episode, I've set up a little bit of a kangaroo court. I've got my guest nice and ambushed here, and he actually is the host of my favorite English learning podcast. He's absolutely guilty of this. He is the host of the History of English podcast, Kevin Stroud. Welcome to the show, Kevin.
Hi, Glenn. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, not a problem. Not a problem. It's been well worth getting you on the show after a little bit of a stuff around. But I have been absolutely fascinated with your show, and especially as an English teacher. It's pretty much mandatory viewing for anyone that is teaching English, and perhaps for a lot of people who have an interest in history that are also interested in learning English at the same time. So could you tell me a little bit about your podcast, Kev?
Yeah, as you said, it's the History of English podcast. I began it a little over 10 years ago, so it's a long-running podcast at this point. It is a chronological history of the English language, which may sound fascinating to some of your listeners. It may sound incredibly boring to others, but what I try to do in the podcast is provide a chronological narrative going all the way back before English to the original Proto-Indo-European language, which is believed to be the ancestor of almost all European languages, as well as many languages in South Asia. And I just tell a story, and it's kind of half history and half language. And I think that helps to keep the listener involved and provides this kind of ongoing narrative. And I've taken the story from there through kind of the Middle East, and then into Europe and Greek and Rome, and then Old English and Middle English. And currently I'm up to basically the late 1500s, so the period of William Shakespeare. And my intention is to go all the way up to and maybe through the 20th century. So I'm closer to the end than the beginning, but I still have a long way to go.
Yeah, it's a monumental project, and a really, really, really fascinating project. And so what actually inspired you to take on this project?
It's a great question, and it's probably a lot of different factors. I mean, I had been exposed to the idea of the original Indo-European language in college, and I had studied some linguistics in college. I'm not a linguist, though, and I always try to make that clear. I'm actually an attorney, practicing attorney. So I do not have a degree in either English or linguistics or history, for that matter. So I don't know why I'm doing a History of English podcast, but it's just something that fascinated me. And it was the early days of podcasting when I first started working on this project 12 years ago. And it was mostly just people talking about things that fascinated them. It wasn't really a platform with a lot of academics and authors and real, qualified experts. It was just everyday people just sharing something they found interesting with other people. And I especially found that, as I said, the deeper history of English, going back before English, the Indo-Europeans, and making the connection between English and other European languages, Latin and French and the Germanic languages and Spanish. And I just found it, with a few basic little tools that you can learn, you can make so many connections between English words and words in those languages. And we have so many of those words borrowed into English. And it's just a fascinating topic if you dig into it a little bit and focus in on the details. And I had never really seen anything presented in that kind of detail that combined a historical narrative with language. And so it was just an idea, and I decided to start working on it. And here I am 12 years later, still working on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's an expression that often gets labeled with English, is that English is actually four different languages hiding in a trench coat, all jammed together. And it's kind of almost impossible to learn English without having some kind of historical understanding of English.
it makes the language, it's very revealing, and I think it makes it much more interesting. And I always say that there's a lot of people that will never listen to my podcast because the title alone seems
Mm.
so boring, but I I tend to grab them and suck them in once they start listening, because I think the average listener doesn't really understand how interesting the topic can be,
Mm.
if you kind of pull the curtain back, pull the shade back and show people how the language really works, where it came from, all those weird questions people have. Why do we spell, words like phone with a PH instead of an
Mm.
F, and all these weird rules we have. Why do you have one leaf with an F at the end, but a bunch of leaves with a V at the end? And these are questions I think we always have growing up. They're never really explained. And part of the project that I put together is trying to explain why those, weird aspects of English exist. And I find it fascinating. And so I hope other people do as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably one of the first things that they will encounter in listening to your podcast is the different pluralization of some English words. For example, ox and oxen at the end of the words with an en. So a little bit of a cheat. Can you give us why some English words are pluralized with an en on the end?
Again, so if we were to go back in time over 1,000 years ago, we would be in the period of Old English. And what we would find is that there wasn't one generic S or ES ending to mark a plural. There were a lot of different endings. In fact, that's a whole separate story, because the way
Mm-hmm.
Old English worked was very different. It was based on endings of words, inflectional endings. So you would have had a lot of different endings at the time. What happened over the course of the Middle English period, so say from around 1100 through around, let's say 13 or 1400, in that period, it all got condensed down to a simple S or ES ending. But there are a few stragglers in the language. So you have words like oxen, brethren, these types of words. There aren't very many of them, where, children, where there are still a few lingering in inflections hanging on. And then, of course, we have a few where you don't have any ending at all, like deer. A lot of times animals that
Yeah,
you
sheep.
hunt, sheep, yeah. So we have some. Then, of course, you have certain words with Latin endings. So you have alumnus versus alumni, and you get a lot of the, so we borrowed some of them into the language and kept them. But the short answer really is that English has been simplified to give us a kind of generic S ending, but we do have some lingering older forms in the language.
And you can see these still in the Germanic languages, or
Yeah.
the more like straightforward Germanic languages, like in Dutch, for example, they still use the en
And they were very
thing. And
common. If you read even Shakespeare, you'll find that there are passages where he refers to shoes, but in other passages where he refers to shoon,
there you go.
using an older N. And in fact, some of those N endings were still very common as late as the 1500s and early 1600s. So they really haven't well, they still haven't completely disappeared, but most of them really didn't disappear until the modern English period.
Yeah, and so one of the other things that listeners to your show will come across in terms of the sort of the English historical legacy type issues, and the reason for why this episode is called Kangaroo Court is also with the K and the K sound, the K letter, the C letter, the C sound, and from then the CH as well. So this is one of the probably one of the first things that listeners to your show will go, aha, this is why it's like this in modern English or English today. So what happened with the C and the K and the CH to make this such a big jumble? Why is it sometimes like a K? Why is it sometimes a S? Why is it a Ch? Why is CH sometimes a K as well? What is going on here?
Well, do we have an hour to talk about it? It's one of those topics that I could probably give
Well,
you in a full hour, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not
at
going
this
to do
point,
that.
go and listen to the history of English podcast, because
It's episode 5.
it's already covered.
Episode 5
Exactly. Yeah.
of the history. No, the short answer is it just simply has to do with sound changes and the fact that the way words are pronounced, they're constantly changing. Lest anyone be under a misconception that the way we speak today is exactly the same way as people spoke 3 or 4 centuries ago. It's not. And the further back in time you go, the more radically different the language is. I talked about Old English from 1,000 years ago, that's the language that Beowulf was composed in. And if you've ever tried to read Beowulf or look at it in the original Old English, it's like a foreign language. And even if you heard it, recited, it would be like a foreign language. So that's how radically the language has changed. But the short answer to your question is that at one time, if we were to go back to Latin, because English uses the Latin alphabet, at that time, originally, the letter C always represented the K sound, k. Simple. It was easy as it could be. And that's the way English borrowed it. That's the way it kind of passed into late Latin. But then things started to change. And really throughout Europe, it changed in different ways in different places. But basically what happened is when words that had a K sound before what's called a front vowel. So that's a vowel that we would represent today with letter E or I. When that happened, the sound changed. What tended to happen is it moved forward in the mouth. And in late Latin and early French, the sound became an S sound. So it went from k to s. Now, same kind of change happened in England in Old English, but there it became a ch sound. So k to ch. But nevertheless, similar process at work. And what ends up happening is ultimately, if you think about, we have the Norman Conquest in 1066. That's the real big event in the history of English. The French invade from Normandy and they conquer England. And ultimately, French becomes the kind of the official language of England for about 3 centuries. And what ends up happening during that period is not only does English borrow a ton of French words, fundamentally changing the vocabulary, but we also borrow a lot of French spelling standards. And since the French used the C as an S when it appeared before an E or an I, because that's the sound it made, English adopted that practice as well. And so that's basically the way we use it today. If you think about when a C appears before an A or an O or a U, like cat or cot or cut, it still has its original k sound. That's the way English, and that's the way Latin and English and most Western European languages have always worked. But what changes though is when it appears before an E or an I. So you have words like, again, cell, like CLL, or civil, those kinds of words, circle. What ends up happening in those words is, of course, we reflect the way it would have been pronounced in French, and those are all French words. But English still had words that were still pronounced with its original K sound. So a word like king originally was spelled with a C in Old English because C was used for the letter K, or C was used for the K sound. And so English had to figure out how to deal with that. And so what it ultimately ended up doing is that in those native English words like king and kindred, these types of words, that were spelled with a C previously, they just brought in the letter K. Now the letter K had been in the alphabet since the time of the Roman Empire, but the Romans didn't really use the letter K. Just they didn't need it. They used the letter C. So what the English scribes decided to do is, well, we've got this letter sitting out there, so we're just going to bring it into the language and we'll use it for these words where the K sound appears before an I or an E. So king and kill, and you can figure out all the other words. So that's why we spell those words with a K. There are some exceptions, and one of the exceptions that I mentioned in the podcast is the word kangaroo, where we could spell it CA, but that's a borrowed word that came ultimately from Australian Aboriginal languages. And so we kind of maintain, that's a newer word. So the rules I just kind of went through apply to older words that went through this Old English, Middle English, early modern English process. But sometimes we do have words that are exceptions because they've been borrowed into the language more recently.
Well, interestingly, on that though, when we say kangaroo in Spanish, canguro, that is actually spelt with a C, for example.
Interesting. Yeah. So what's ultimately happened is English has now adopted a spelling standard where you can kind of go either way with it in some of these borrowed words. So there's not really a rule as it applies today. But nevertheless, it does lie in the history. And as a general rule today, when a C appears before an E or an I, it's usually pronounced as an S. When it appears before an A or U, it's pronounced as a K. And that simply goes back to some basic sound changes that took place, back in late Latin and early French, really.
Yeah, so basically we can blame the French like we always do.
Yeah, we can to a certain extent. And again, English is a bit of a, I hesitate to call it a hybrid language, but I think it's really fascinating to see how fundamentally different English is today versus what it was before the Norman Conquest. Because one of English's closest relatives is Dutch, and if you look at it historically, and it's very likely that modern English would be much closer to Dutch than its current incarnation had the Norman Conquest never occurred. And I'm not sure that they would necessarily be mutually intelligible, but I think that's a better kind of model for where English would have gone had it not been for the influence of French. Once you introduce the French aspect into it, it just sends it in a whole different direction.
Yeah, and so this gives us the other aspect of why do we say like chemistry with a k and chef with a sh, for example, and obviously because chemistry is a Greek word, and so it maintains the k, whereas chef is a French word, so it has the sh sound, and so that's really that's sort of basically the easiest way that we can explain it, to be honest.
You're dealing with literally thousands of years of sound changes. And so, if you go back to ancient Greek, a word like that, like choir, for example, comes from Greek chemistry. These are words that would have probably been pronounced with more of an aspirated K sound. That's why the H was in there, because H usually indicates some type of aspiration. So it would have been more like which is a sound that English used to have a little bit of that as well, but not anymore, standard English. But anyway, so what ends up happening though is those words pass out of Greek through Latin. Latin doesn't really have that sound, so that aspiration falls away, and they go from to just k, and that's how English ends up borrowing them as well. So what you end up with is a lot of words in English where you have a ch that's just pronounced as a k sound.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation. And one of your episodes, you talk about like the movement of sort of the Bible into Greek as well, and this is also why so many of words related to religion have a ch spelling and a k sound as well, I suppose, because it's probably actually taken from a different sound originally. Is that correct as well?
Yeah, I mean, think about words like Christ,
Eucharist.
Eucharist. Yeah, a lot of those, particularly Christian terms, come from Greek because the Greek was the language of the New Testament. And even probably the word church, which begins in Greek, passes probably through the Gothic language, which was an old Germanic language that's disappeared, and then enters English, though, more as kirk, Kirk, which still survives in northern England and Scotland, a very common word there. But in early Old English, you have another sound change. And just as the K sound is softened to an S sound in French, in Old English, it was softened to more of an CH sound. So there, again, KI, there's your front vowel. So instead of kirk, it becomes church in Old English.
There
And then,
you
of
go.
course, church today. So yeah, you can make these connections and follow this history. And all you really need to know is a handful of basic sound changes to account for a lot of this stuff. But yeah, it explains so much about the way English works, and even explains a lot of spelling. Most languages have reformed their spellings over the years. English is not, obviously. Well, generally is not. I mean, there have been little attempts here and there. I mean, Noah Webster tried to reform, American English
And
spellings, and that's why
along
we have
along
some
with
differences.
along with Benjamin Franklin, is
Yeah.
that correct?
Yeah, I tried, but I think it's really Noah Webster. We'd have to give
Okay.
most of the credit or blame for the reason why Americans dropped the U in color and say theater with an ER instead of an RE and those types of things.
So,
But
so
these are minor
yeah.
changes, though, really.
So there's sort of a bit of a joke. If we were going to be mean about American English at this point in time, we would call American English simplified English for this reason.
No, I mean, at least in that regard, that was the idea. I mean, that was what Noah Webster was saying, really.
Yeah.
He was saying, hey, we're a new country. Because remember, he's writing in the early 1800s, new country. He's a patriot. He's saying, we don't need to follow all this old world stuff. We
Yeah.
can, and a lot of these spellings, they had become antiquated. They were influenced by French. They
Mm.
didn't necessarily represent the way the words were spelled. But I guess some of his spellings stuck with us and some of them didn't. But yeah, that's where we really get a lot of the differences we have today with
Yeah.
American spellings.
And because all of this was happening at the same time as Australia was being settled as well. And so we might think of, for example, Australian English as purely British English, but it's absolutely not. And so, although it is, a derivation of British English, it actually has a lot of similarities with American English, and particularly American English at this point in time of history as well. What are the obvious similarities and obvious differences that you can point to, and especially from this period of time?
So as an introduction to answering that question, let me return to something I said earlier, which is that languages are always changing. And that's certainly true with English. So English of the 1500s was a little bit different from English of the 1600s and then 1700s and so on. So when we think about similarities and differences between American English and Australian English, we have to think about timing differences, because North America, and I'm including Canada in here as well. So North America is settled really in the 1600s. That's when the main settlement occurs into the early 1700s. That's when American English, the foundation, is established. So there are a lot of aspects of American English that reflect the way English worked in the 1600s and early 1700s. But American English adopts its own rules and changes, but back in England, the language changes as well over time and is a different language in many respects once you get to the 1700s. Then you have really the settlement in Australia, mainly in the 1800s, late 1700s, but really the 1800s is when Australian English starts to be established. So you're dealing with about a century and a half delay, and that can explain some similarities, but also some differences. There's also a regional aspect to it as well, because settlement patterns were sometimes regional. And I think, at least my understanding from most historical linguists, is that Australia tended to be settled heavily by people from the southeastern part of England.
Yes, correct.
So
And
London,
southern London, yeah, south
yeah.
of London, yeah.
So say London and the surrounding environments and further south and east. In America, it's a little more complicated because you had the southern colonies. The Virginia colony was settled really heavily from the west country of England. So, and then the Massachusetts colony was settled from the southeastern part, East Anglia, and down into Kent and some of those areas. So basically, while American English, one of the basic similarities, we'll start with that, between American English and Australian English, and this is really fascinating, is that in both cases, early on in the first century or so after settlement, there was very little accent differences within the language. That's still true today in Australian English to a large extent. It's a very uniform dialect. Now, I think linguists would say there are some very slight regional variations, but for the most part, to be as as big as Australia is, to be the cities to be far apart, sometimes relatively isolated, the accent, the dialects are very, very similar. And what we have in American English was largely the same thing. If we look at accounts from the 1700s and early 1800s, travelers who came from England were always commented about how they would travel throughout the colonies or throughout the early United States, and everyone seemed to speak the same way. And they were fascinated about that, because in England, you can travel from one town to the next town and people speak almost completely differently, So they were fascinated. But what apparently happens is, of course, once you mix people together, there's kind of a leveling off of the accent. And so that's something that was very similar in American English and Australian English. Now, there were, as I said, some regional differences. So let's talk about rhoticity for a second, which is the pronunciation of the R sound after a vowel. And I'm kind of simplifying the idea, but whereas I would say, car with a hard R, because American English tends to be rhotic,
I would say car. Yeah.
Without
the
hard
R.
R sound. Yeah. And so this is a fundamental difference between American, now I say American English, let's say standard American English, because there's some variation, and kind of standard Australian English, but also, of course, standard British English. Well, this has to do with timing and location, because in the 1600s, when North America was being settled, people in England were much more likely to pronounce their R's. It was rhotic more so than today. And the only real part of England where the people didn't pronounce their R's was in that southeastern corner of the country. Well, we know that most of the settlers, or at least there were a lot of settlers early on in Massachusetts, came from that southeastern corner of England. And so in North America, even to this day, that areas around Boston, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, those areas still have a non-rhotic accent. It's very famous. People here will say, park the car in Harvard Yard,
which sounds like an Australian. Yeah. And I have a little story about this. When I did my English teaching by my CELTA in, there you go, there's a word, my CELTA in Buenos Aires. We were teaching to English learners, and one of the students was absolutely adamant I was from Boston. He's like, no, where in Boston are you from? And he did. I said, no, I'm from Australia. And he said, no, I have a friend from Boston, and you sound like him. So he was picking up exactly the same accent differences that the Bostonian accent is actually probably famous for.
Well, let me give you another, I think, aspect of that. And because it's not just the lack of the R sound, because like I said, there are a fair number of accents, even in the United States, that are non-rhotic. But I think some of that also comes in with that vowel, that A sound in car. This gets a little bit in the weeds, but it's fascinating, because if we were to go back in time, let's think about it today. Linguists call it the Bath set of words. So it's words like bath, path, last, class. American English has that ah sound in it. And that was once pretty standard in English up until the 1700s. So that's why American English has preserved it. But in the 1700s in Southern England, that started to change, and it went from ah to ah. So you get bath, class, that's kind of much more back kind of ah sound. It's only, not every word would add that sound. Words like trap, for example, would retain the older version. Now, this happened in the south of England. So if you're from the north of England, you don't tend to pronounce words that way. You tend to sound a little bit more like American English in that regard. But what happens is that sound is changing in southern England at a time when Australia starts to be settled. So I think when you look at Australian English today, this is something that fascinates me. I think you're going to find that that vowel is not the American vowel. It's not and it's not the British vowel, Southern English vowel. It's not aw. It's somewhere in between.
And it's actually in this space, there is actually a recognized what we call a triphthong in Australian English. So what is it? That there's usually eight diphthongs in British English or whatever,
Right.
and six in American English. But officially, there is 7 diphthongs in Australian English and 1 triphthong. And so we actually make the 8 sounds, but the 8th sound is distinct.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting feature of Australian English and the accent.
And like I said, I think, how would you pronounce D-A-N-C-E?
Dance.
Dance. So it's a fascinating word because that word has more of an ah sound to it, but how would you pronounce the word bath?
Bath.
Different vowel. Now, in England, those would be part of the same vowel set. So
Exactly.
people that would tend to say bath would tend to say dance.
Dance.
And most English accents will do that. They'll be the same vowel. So Americans will say bath and dance. Australian English is a little bit funny in that regard because, and this I'm speaking in general terms, it's not true for everybody, but there's a tendency, I think, in Australian English to do kind of a little more of a back vowel. It's not the British vowel, but more of a bath kind of pronunciation. But I think that's very similar to the vowel sound you'll hear in New England, in Massachusetts. And I think that's why some listeners will pick up on that. But then that dance vowel is very close to the American English pronunciation. So again, you have this kind of hybrid going on in Australian English. Some of this just has to do maybe with timing, but also maybe has to do with influence of American English. I've read that in Australian English, that dance vowel is also a little bit of a regional variation.
It could be.
You get more of the ah in places like Sydney and the southeast, and then as you get more westward, it becomes more of an ah. And to the extent that it is regional, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't, it's showing that there may be some evolution in Australian English that's creating these regional dialects.
And in particular with this, probably the first change that was noted was in South Australia, because in South Australia, this was the only place in Australia that didn't have convicts in it. It was all free settlers. And so they generally came from a different class of people to the rest of Australia. And so these people have sort of much more of what we would call a private school accent, maybe more of a BBC accent, you might. And so that kind of lingers on. It was always sort of a long time ago in Australia, it was common for news presenters, they had to have a BBC accent. And so that kind of cultural impact does have its lingering impacts in certain areas of Australia. And another interesting thing with the Massachusetts, the Boston thing, and this is really an important aspect of that area's English and of Australian English as well, is at the time there was a lot of Irish settlement. And from that, we have the Boston Celtics and things like this. And in Australia, we also had a lot of Irish settlement at the same time as well. So it's not just from that southern England that area was settled. It was also the following Irish settlement. So there's not just one particular period of time that coincides with this area. It's actually 2. So this area of American English and Australian English is probably actually much more similar than it would otherwise be if only one of these things had happened.
And there's a very similar dynamic at work, of course, in American English, because I said that American English, when you deal with that issue of rhoticity, pronouncing that R sound after a vowel, it was once common in the South to also have a non-rhotic accent. So, you have those very, gone with the wind type, very aristocratic type accents where people kind of speak with without a hard R sound. But today, most accents in the South are rhotic, but we have to keep in mind there was an initial wave of settlement kind of along the coast, but then you had the Irish and Scots-Irish settlement came behind it and involved a lot of settlement in the Appalachian Mountain region, which was a little bit more inland. Those were rhotic accents. So you had this kind of blending going on where you had kind of an initial settlement from southwestern England, then you have settlement from the Midlands, and then Scotland and Ireland, and it all kind of starts to mix together. And it makes it very difficult to trace modern accents all the way back to England. But there are some, kind of general tendencies that we can discern if we can weave our way through all that complicated history.
And then we come back to the expression Kangaroo Court, and in particular where this came from, and also the accent shifts and the accent influences on both America and on Australia as well. If we go to California, the west coast of America, this also has an influence on Australian English, and Australian English at that time also has an influence on American English. And so are you full bottle on this as well?
So now I'll tell you, I am to a certain extent, but there are controversies around the etymology of Kangaroo Court. So I know what you're getting at, because you're probably tapping into the idea that it came from the 49ers and Australian probably settlement there. So that's a good theory. So let's break it down a little bit. So let's start with kangaroo. We know kangaroo, Aboriginal term for the animal, traces back to
and this is also controversial as well.
Controversial because it's first recorded by Captain Cook, and then others come along after him, and they say, well, no one says kangaroo. He's got it wrong. He screwed it up. They must have been saying, we don't understand what you're saying, and he just misunderstood it, and that's where kangaroo comes from. But I think what's happened though in more recent history is, my understanding is linguists have found out that it actually it's like Kangaroo or something. It's like a dialect word that's used by certain Aboriginal groups in the northeastern part of Australia, which is where Captain Cook apparently was at the time when he was having ship repairs. So I think he probably did hear the word correctly. It was just a local dialect word. And what's happened is
it's interesting because the first settlers seem to have a big trouble distinguishing the g sound and the k sound. For example, we have a very famous national park in the north of Australia called Kakadu, but in the local language, it's actually called Gagaju.
So that would make sense. That would make sense that you're from voice to voiceless sounds and all that. Anyway, so that gives us kangaroo. And then I think the next step here is at some point, kangaroos were brought back to England. So this is like maybe early 1800s, and people are fascinated by them. They've never seen this type of animal. What is it? And so there's at least some evidence that within England in the early 1800s, the word kangaroo started to be associated with things that were unusual or kind of marvelous or strange. It kind of sometimes is used in that context. I'm just going to leave that there for a second because that could be part of the story. So skip forward. The term kangaroo court is fascinating because even though it uses the word kangaroo, it is apparently not an Australian term. It is very much an Americanism. It was a term that was apparently coined in the United States. And the first evidence we have of it is from, I think, 1853 in a book that was composed at specifically talking about Texas, and specifically it uses a reference where they talk about, I think it was called A Stray Yankee in Texas is the name of the book. And it has a phrase in there where, and this comes from the Oxford English Dictionary, where it refers to a Mustang or Kangaroo Court. This is the first reference. So what's a Mustang? Of course, a Mustang is kind of a half-trained horse. It's very wild. It's bucks. It jumps around a lot. And so one theory, it's not the theory you suggested necessarily, a slightly different one, is that the word was originally a Mustang court, referring to a court that was kind of wild and out of control, and you didn't know. I mean, this is frontier. Texas in the 1800s, you have frontier justice. You don't have the American legal system involved necessarily. It's more kind of people doing their own thing. And so this idea of a wild Mustang being applied to these kind of local fly-by-night courts. And by that point, people were familiar with kangaroos. They jump. That's the obvious thing you think of with a kangaroo, much like a Mustang. So at some point, people started calling these courts kangaroo courts. And maybe that's the connection. And it does sort of make sense if you look at the original usage. But within, I think, the second citation comes like 30, 40 years later, and it's being used in regard to people in jail who are kind of have these kind of informal tribunals where they settle disputes, and they're called kangaroo courts. And usually they're deceptive. They take advantage of new inmates and take their money. And the idea of them being predetermined and unjust is kind of apparently comes from that idea. So one theory, though, that has been very popular through the years is that the term originated on the West Coast in and around California during the the gold rush beginning in 1849, because that's when we first kind of see the word appearing. And the idea is that it is actually easier for Australians to get to California than it was for people on the East Coast of the United States to get to California. Because if you're on the East Coast, you had to cross all the way across the continent. There were no good roads. You had to cross mountains and deserts.
There was no
You had
railway
hostile native indigenous tribes sometimes. I mean, you could be attacked by bandits, and who knows what was going to happen. Whereas in Australia, it wasn't an easy passage, but you could just sail there. So there were apparently a fair amount of Australians who took part in that gold rush. And the idea is that they, again, it's the Wild West, the 1800s. So you had a lot of what were called claim jumpers. So someone stakes a claim, and then somebody comes in and claims it, and this created all kinds of legal disputes. And these people were called jumpers. And so it's thought that many of maybe the Australians working there started calling these courts kangaroo courts, because the idea comes from jumping, jumpers, jumping claim jumpers, make that connection. And again, frontier justice, fly-by-night courts, you kind of get the sense of where the word kangaroo court might come from in that regard. I think the only real question there is was there enough time for that word? If the gold rush begins in 1849, how long does it take Australians to get there? Then for that word to be coined and work its way into the language and make its way to Texas, where it's first recorded 4 years later. I think that's the only question I have about the timing of all that. There's another interesting little side note to this. There was a very prominent etymologist, someone who studied the origin of terms in America, called Charles Earl Thunk. He wrote a series of books on words and phrases, particularly in American English. And in one of his early books, he had an article on Kangaroo Court. Well, and he said this is same basic etymology. He thought it came probably from 49ers from Australia and brought it with him. And while he was writing his fourth book, he passed away, and his son picked up his work and finished the fourth book and included a separate entry on the term. And in the interim, before he died, Mr. Funk had written to someone he knew in Australia and asked them if they had any, because this is the 1940s and 50s, so it wasn't long before the internet. So he wrote to a companion, someone he knew in Australia, and he said, anyone do you know of has ever heard the term kangaroo court before? Or, is it is it a native term? Because I don't think it is. And the person said, no, it's not really an Australian term, but I'm going to reach out. And there was an inquiry placed, I guess, in maybe a newspaper or something, if anyone was familiar with the term. And someone had responded that they had recalled being out in an area near Alice Springs. So we're talking, I guess, kind of central
Central
Australia, kind
Australia.
of middle of nowhere, with all due respect. And I live in the middle of nowhere in the United States, but and they said that they had heard the term jumper's court, and with a very similar meaning as an old Australian term. And it came from the notion that kangaroos, and it was tied to kangaroos, the idea that kangaroos would sit in the distance and stare at humans as long as humans didn't get too close. And
That
they
is
would
what they
just sit,
do.
yeah, they just sit there and stare. And the analogy was made to one of these kind of mock courts where everything's predetermined, where the judge or the jury is just sitting there not listening to what you're saying because the outcome is predetermined. They just sit there with a blank look on their face and then immediately rule against you. And so there was a suggestion that that's where the word jumper's court had come from in this particular region of Australia. And that might have been brought over and been modified to Kangaroo Court. So maybe, possibly, there is this connection, but I think it's a little bit tenuous. I think it's one of the two theories that either Australians in California coined it during the gold rush, or it's tied to the idea of the Mustang jumping around in kind of a wild, out of control court.
That's really, really fascinating. So don't put the expression kangaroo court in a kangaroo court, because we don't actually know
Yeah. It's
what
funny
what the
you're
truth of
asking
this is.
about that, because I listened to a news podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's The News Agents, but it's a podcast made in Britain by two former BBC reporters who started a podcast. It focuses mainly on British politics, but they were discussing the etymology of kangaroo court like
There you
yesterday or
go.
day before,
Wow.
because Boris Johnson, the former prime minister, was just an investigation was done by the Parliament there, the House of Commons, and they found him guilty for certain indiscretions, and he dismissed it. He called it a kangaroo court, and they were wondering where did that term come from? How did
Yeah.
and again, and they came up with the same etymology. Someone apparently wrote in and said it came from the 49ers in Australia, and so that seems to be I think the more generally accepted etymology. But as I said, I'm not 100% sold on it. I think the other one may make sense as well, tying it to, again, kind of a wild animal jumping around in a
Mm.
wild, out of control frontier court. But maybe some blend of the two.
And then there is something that has definitely come into Australian English, definitely from the United States, in basically actually Spanish, and that word is bonza, from the same group of expressions. So bonza for us is something that's great, it's fantastic, and this actually comes from bonanza.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
so this is something that's influenced Australian English in return. So yeah, that is absolutely fascinating. Thank you for telling us about that, because you gave me
Yeah.
some information that I didn't know either, which is exactly why I listen to your podcast. So so so
Glad to help.
so do you learn any languages at all, or do you only speak English?
So, I mean, I'm not fluent in any other language. My language of study when I was in high school and in college was French. So I
Mm.
had 3 years in high school and then a couple of years of it in college. Now, mind you, that's over 30 years ago for me. So I've forgotten a large portion of it, though I have now started to recall it because I deal so much with French in doing the History of English podcast. I also did study Mandarin for a while
Mm.
in college as well, enough to just kind of get the basics down and try to master the tones of the language and that kind of thing.
Ni
Um,
hao, xie xie, that
yeah,
sort of stuff.
yeah. So, and again, that's 30 years ago on that too. But I think that those are the only, formal languages I've studied. Now, I know a bit of Spanish. Spanish is the dominant foreign language spoken, where I live. And so,
Mm.
obviously English is the dominant language, but we have a lot of Spanish speakers and a
Mm.
lot of them that do, basic work. So, you encounter a lot of Spanish speakers on a daily basis, just in routine matters. And so, I've acquired, my wife is a much better Spanish speaker than I am, but I never formally studied it, but
Well, I
get
was
bits and
thinking
pieces.
that with your show, it's probably impossible not to know quite a bit about Latin, French, these
Yeah.
sorts of languages. I
Well,
think.
I've learned a lot doing the podcast. And the one thing that I always say that I regret that I don't have a better background in is German or Germanic languages,
Mm,
because when I went through the Old English period, that's really where there are so many connections between English and Dutch and German and
mm.
Scandinavian languages. And I wish I had a better, and that would have been presented differently if I had had more of a background in those languages. But I tried to do it as best I could under the
Yeah,
circumstances.
it's interesting because since listening to your podcast, I've started learning Dutch simply because of that reason. Because it got me interested in going, okay, well, what are the actual similarities? Maybe like, and it's
Mm.
actually helped my teaching and understanding English as well. So we
There's a
were.
great story about that, because the person who discovered the Beowulf poem, because it only exists
Mhm.
in one version, was, I think, a Dutch scholar looking for Dutch manuscripts. I think I'm recalling this correctly a long time ago, and thought it was a Dutch poem when he
Wow,
first discovered it, only to realize later, having giving it more study, that it was actually Old English.
there you
So
go.
the languages were so close at that time.
It was like finding the Rosetta Stone kind
Yeah,
of.
yeah.
So, we were speaking about this before the recorded show, but there is a reason why, and it's probably one of the best pieces of advice that I've been given as a language teacher studying literacy training and whatnot, is not to oversimplify language, to actually keep these differences when we are teaching, because each word has a story. And so for you, why do you think it is important to learn the history of a language at the same time as learning the language?
I think it's what makes the language fascinating.
Mm,
And for so many students, they don't like English class. It's boring, it's dry. I don't know if they still do it, but I know when I was in school, we had to diagram sentences, and it's very tough on some students. And I think it's a topic that can be made very interesting and very fascinating to people if it's presented the right way. And I think
mm,
a lot of times, and I'm not an academic, but I think a lot of times it's simply not presented the right way.
mm,
And the right way, in terms of making it interesting and keeping people, fascinated with it and understand it and want to learn more about it, is to explain why English works the way it does. Why
mm.
do we have rather than saying that's just the way it is, that's the way we spell it, that's
or
the way we
blame or
pronounce
blame
it.
the French.
Yeah, if you can explain it, and it doesn't require a college degree to understand the basics. There are just a
Mm,
few just basic little rules. It may not, there are always going to be exceptions, so it's not going to explain
mm,
every case. But I do think if there was more of an emphasis on teaching the why, not just the what, not just the how, but the why of way English works, it would make it more interesting. I think students would pick up on it. They would learn it easier and quicker. They'd be less judgmental, quite
mm.
frankly, in terms of being pedantic and saying, well, this is the grammar rule of English, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Well, if you understood the history of English, you'd understand why that sometimes is very silly, because the rules are often arbitrary,
Mm,
imposed. A lot of times we have a lot of Latin rules imposed on English. So I do think that it would be helpful. And I got to tell you, I have a lot of English teachers reach out to me over time, over the years, with that same sentiment. And they all, a lot of them tell me that they pick up things from the podcast and they
mm,
tell their students, and their students love it. And sometimes they
mm,
assign them maybe an episode to listen to. But I think that's the key, is, as I said, just finding ways to keep students interested, explaining the why and how English developed. I think that's the real idea.
Yeah, I can probably give my listeners a more concrete example of this. One of my favorite things to teach my kids is why we call the Tyrannosaurus Rex Tyrannosaurus Rex. And so once they find out that Rex is king and Tyrannosaurus relates to tyrant or bad or, destructive, they go, wow.
Mm-hmm.
So his name Tyrannosaurus Rex actually means, really big, bad, powerful dinosaur.
One of the first examples I gave in the podcast, and I put it there intentionally because I find it fascinating, is the connection between Zeus and Jupiter, and actually a Germanic god named Tiu, which gives us the word Tuesday because it's Tuesday. But they all come from the same Indo-European root. At one time, they were the same word, and it means sky father in the original Indo-European language. But some basic sound changes happen, and it becomes, Zeus pater in Greek and shortened to Zeus, Jupiter in Latin, Tiu in Germanic languages. And we have all three versions in English today, all in a similar sense, But if you just kind of know that little bit of history, it makes it so much more interesting. And it brings these various cultures together, in a much more kind of holistic view of the language and languages and history. Rather than seeing it all as a bunch of individual random parts, you start to see everything as interconnected. And I think that's important as well.
And so where to now for the History of English podcast?
Keep moving forward. I've got to cover Shakespeare, and that's the most daunting thing I've covered so far, because there's so much. I mean, you would think Shakespeare would be pretty straightforward, but there's nothing straightforward about Shakespeare. I mean, everything about Shakespeare is controversial.
Yeah, you might have to delegate. Maybe you need to delegate this out to actually a Shakespearean expert and just go, well, it's not my responsibility if I get something
but
wrong
that's
here.
the thing. That's the thing. If I'm talking about Geoffrey Chaucer, another important English writer from a couple of centuries earlier, there are some people out there who know a lot about Geoffrey Chaucer and know a whole lot more than I'll ever know, but there are not very many of them, let's be honest. Okay.
And they're not fanatic like Shakespeare
right.
fans, are they?
When you get to Shakespeare, I mean, probably a quarter of my listeners probably consider themselves experts on Shakespeare. So at any rate, no, it's just one of those very daunting subjects because so little is known with certainty. There's so much debate, so much controversy. There's so much to know. And people already have opinions about so much of it. So it's just very daunting to figure out how to present that information. And look, if I say something that's controversial, it's controversial. So what? I'm not that worried about that. But it's just I like to be accurate when I give information. And if there's controversy, I like to acknowledge it. But I don't want everything I say to be conditioned by saying, well, not everybody agrees on this, and not everybody agrees on that. And here's something else not everybody agrees on. So, and also trying to build a narrative, because in my podcast, I do everything kind of on a historical narrative and tying into language to history. And that's tough with Shakespeare because we don't really know that much about him for certain. And without even getting into the controversy of whether someone else wrote all the Shakespeare stuff, which is a whole another can of worms to get into. So, it's very challenging. I'm going to try to push through that. And from there, it really, I think, from post Shakespeare to the current era is going to focus a lot on accents and dialects, because that's going to be the period when English spreads around the world. British Empire, another controversy, but nevertheless, that's how English spreads around the world. And I think I'm really looking forward to that. I'm kind of dreading the Shakespeare period. I'm looking forward to the period after it, because I think that's all the things we talked about accents and dialects. That's when we can really start to dig into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And where can people find your show?
It's very simple. The History of English podcast. That's the website too, historyofelglishpodcast.com. And, pretty much any podcast provider has it. It's been around for a long time. So, it's nothing new about it. And I would encourage your listeners, if they're interested in the topic and the history of English, to check it out.
Yeah, fantastic. And you've got a Patreon as well. So where can they, if they're interested in getting more out of the show, where can they go?
It's patreon.com/ /history of English. And the way I normally do it, and I'm taking a little bit of a break here in the summer of 2023, but I normally produce a regular episode of the podcast every month, and it's about usually an hour or more than an hour in length. And I also produce a separate bonus episode at Patreon, which is a little shorter. And those are kind of random topics. They can be about anything that doesn't have to necessarily tie into the regular podcast, but just fun little, side. I did an episode on, the mid-Atlantic accent that was common in movies in the 20s and 30s. And I did an episode on the Beatles and how their unique Liverpool accent reflects in their songs, and little things like that are just a little bit of a digression, and they're fun just to kind of get me off the narrative and give me a little break for a while.
Absolutely. Fantastic. It's been fantastic having you come into this Kangaroo Court. And like you've probably guessed from this episode, all my listeners out there, I consider it to be mandatory listening, especially for English teachers, really. And anyone that is interested in learning about a little bit more about pronunciation, where words come from, why we speak, why we say things in a certain way. It answers a lot of people's questions. And that is such a fantastic resource to have. So thank you very much for doing this.
I'm happy to be in your court. You are a fair judge. So it wasn't a kangaroo court, but thank you very much for having me.
Not a problem. We'll catch you around again. So from us here at the Australians Teach English podcast, the podcast by language learners, with language learners, for language learners, it's us saying goodbye.
Goodbye.
For more information about the Australians Teach English Institute, go to australiansteachenglish.com or follow us on Instagram, Facebook and YouTube at Australians Teach English.